I briefly I briefly made reference previously to the fact that Socrates didn't Socrates actually didn't write anything. I don't know if I mentioned that, but he never wrote anything. The only way we know anything about Socrates is from what other people wrote about Socrates. And one of the main people who wrote about him was a guy by the name of Plato. And Plato wrote a lot about Socrates. I mean, you can buy a book, Complete Works of Plato, and it's a very significant book. I mean, 1,000, 2,000 pages. I don't have my copy at the desk where I'm working right now, but it is a very long set of writings, and all of his writings are written in a format where they're written as dialogues. And when I say dialogues, it's essentially written in what we might consider like a play format, where it'll say Socrates, and then it will have Socrates saying something. Then it'll say Plato, and he'll say something. Or, it'll have Euthyphro saying something. So that's the way the entire text goes. It's all a series of basically the conversations Socrates had with people. Now, what happens is Plato lived. Socrates died in 399 BCE, and Plato lived on till now I have to do this off the top of my head, but he lived until I believe around 347 BCE, and he lived about 80 years himself, 70 some years himself, but he had, basically Socrates died when he was in his 20s, maybe 30, and he went ahead and lived another 50 some years, and he continued to write and use Socrates as a character within his writing. And so one of the problems that exists is we sometimes ask, how do we know which ideas come from Plato and which ideas come from Socrates? And the answer is we don't really know. We kind of just think of Socrates and Plato as very similar. We know that Plato, as he got later in his career, he became more interested in issues of politics and social justice, and so his writing tends to focus that way. And we know that because you can kind of look at his writing development and styles, and you know that during different stages of his life he wrote in different styles or different ways, and so you can kind of date his work based upon that. And so they know that some of his later work is about that. As a matter of fact, they believe the last work he was working on when he died was about a city. It was going to be a piece about the perfect state, and he was going to base it on a town called Atlantis. And it was a sunken city, the city that disappeared, and most of you are familiar with it. There's been Disney movies and stuff. And that's all based upon the Platonic. Plato comes from him, and the idea that Plato was basically going to create a mythical city that was the perfect, and he was going to then describe how it was ruled, the system of justice it used. And so we know that's part of his later writing. So we don't know which ideas are Socrates, and we don't know which are Plato's. That the idea is that probably Plato's early writing is very much just a synopsis of discussions that Socrates had. But Socrates has been dead a while, 10, 20 years, and Plato's continued to teach and do philosophy. And so we know that Socrates remains a character. And so Plato begins to surmise, based upon his own conversations, his own experience, how Socrates would have done things. And then as we get into his later life, he's lived longer than he's lived decades longer. He maybe had a relationship with Socrates, a very influential one, in his 20s, but now he's in his 60s, and so he's basically kind of just doing his own thing, talking about his own ideas, but continuing to use Socrates. And so the idea is, which of these are Plato and which of them are Socrates? And we can kind of guess that, they slowly transform, becoming less and less. And the example that sometimes gets thrown out there, it came from a book called Seinfeld and Philosophy. Now, Seinfeld is beginning to become a bit dated, but if you've watched some of the Seinfeld TV series, you'll notice that as you watch the early episodes, it's very much Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian, the man. They're taking some of his comedic work and some of his writing, and they're adapting it into a sitcom format. And as you go along, further and further along, what happens is Jerry Seinfeld can't be as involved. They've basically worked his material into a sitcom, and so they're now having writers develop ideas. And so slowly over time, it transforms from being sort of, the life of Jerry Seinfeld put into a sitcom, less and less, until finally it's really just a reality created by the writers. And that's sort of the same thing that's happening here, where the idea starts, it's mainly Socrates, and slowly it transforms and becomes less and less. And so that's the Socratic problem, is which ones are which. And in the end, I think we just pretty much say, you can use Socrates and Plato interchangeably, but we tend to think of Plato's ideas being more the political ideas, and Socrates' ideas being more ethical and metaphysical in nature. So the forms and things like that are more from Socrates.